We talk a lot about elites in our circles, and this is useful, but often highly abstract. My guest this week is deeply familiar with a living, breathing elite in all its glory, ugliness, and complexity. So I thought we'd do a true deep dive into this elite, whose party ruled Canada for a comparable period in the 20th century to the length of the period the communists ruled Russia. I won't say anything about his identity, but suffice it to say, he knows what he's talking about. Please enjoy. Welcome back to the Becoming Noble podcast. My guest today is Black Horse, who many of you will be familiar with. I've been enjoying Black Horse's discussions on Canadian politics because of how medieval all the power dynamics are. You have huge competing power blocks, each with their own geographic, resource, ethnic, and ideological interests. And this is in the context of a country, Canada, which is naturally difficult to govern, given its scale and diffuse population. And you have these increasingly separatist, resource-rich Western powers, the high elves of the Laurentian Elite, who we're going to talk about today, who inhabit the specific corridor of power, and the Quebecois ethno-state, all locked in contest for the future of Canada. And we're blessed to have a real expert, a Canadian, with us today in Black Horse. And Black Horse is tremendously good at these discussions. So Black Horse, please, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. The content you're referring to there is on my Substack at the Red Ensign. So if you're interested, go and check it out.
Please do, yes. Now, Black Horse has asked me, he speaks good English, but he's asked me to translate for him in French as well as we go. So, bienvenue au podcast Becoming Noble. Je suis votre hôte, Johann Kurtz, le bad boy de la droite. S'il vous plaît, acculez mon ami le cheval noir aujourd'hui.
There you go. You've maxed out my French already.
I had to try. My schoolboy French had to be good for something. This is the first time I've used it in 10 years. So there you go.
Yeah, well, it's I have enough French to know when my Quebecois clients are insulting me, and that's about it.
One thing you said on a previous discussion, which I think is really pertinent and a good way into the discussion, is you said Canada still has real politics. And I think that's a good doorway into the discussion. I don't know if you remember saying that, but if you do, could you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, I've said this repeatedly. Canada has real politics, but kind of fake elections. So if you contrast Canada to a nation like the UK or like France or like Germany, where the political parties don't really correspond particularly to competing groups seeking power in the country. You know, if Labour wins or if the Conservatives win in the UK, the same set of elites will dominate the country in both cases. And you've seen this in the large conservative majority under Johnson versus the large Labour majority under Starmer. There's a very clear continuity between the two. And to the extent that they represent different elites within the United Kingdom, that's a marginal phenomenon. Whereas in Canada, 3 of the 4 largest political parties represent distinct elites with distinct economic interests that inhabit distinct regions and are competing politically just in a very different way. They're not ideological parties. They're parties that represent specific groups of people.
That makes sense. And in that sense, I suppose that's a useful opening to a deeper question, which is sort of what is Canada? I'm not asking for an entire history lesson in the origins of Canada, but if you had to sketch out who those different parties are at that table and how they came to be in the broadest possible terms before we dive slightly more deeply into the Laurentian Elite in particular.
You would ask me later in this podcast to kind of lay out who the Laurentian Elite is. It's probably easiest to tell this story by telling the story of the Laurentian Elite and then come back to the modern fragmented elite. If you look back at Canada, Canada comes into being as a result of the resettlement of loyalists in captured colonial French territory. So during the 7 Years' War, the British captured the Quebec colony. And at the time, it was settled by a group of French Canadians who were some combination of farmers and fur traders. After the Revolutionary War in the United States, the British loyalists in the United States were settled, at least in substantial portion, in territory that formerly belonged to the Quebec colony in Acadia and in what was then called Upper Canada, now called Ontario. That colony was eventually restructured into a political formation called Canada, which in the early 19th century was a British colonial structure that kind of had 2 corridors of power. The first corridor of power was the kind of imperial corridor of power, where there was a set of elites that were both commercially and politically linked to the British Empire. And there was a set of elites that were local, that succeeded in the local political assemblies and that had local business interests of various kinds. So if you imagine one of the early dominant businesses in Canada is the timber industry, and there's a set of elites that are engaged in exporting timber to the UK, and there's a set of elites engaged in like selling machine tools for the purpose of the timber industry. And over the course of the 19th century, as the British Empire peels away the various forms of imperial preference, it strips away by increment the power of the imperial elite and empowers this local group of business owners who eventually begin to form the Laurentian Elite. This is a group of Anglophones who inhabit a region between what was then York, now Toronto, and Montreal. And they are self-conscious as Canadians rather than British, and view London as a threat to their independence and representative of their competing elite class in the kind of early period. This all changes during the First and Second World War. The imperialist elite is essentially killed off, mostly not literally, but somewhat literally. And you end up in the period after the Second World War where there's no real power left to be had in being an imperialist. And really the last swan song of this is the effort by Diefenbaker to kind of merge Anglo-populism with some kind of vision for the Commonwealth, a vision that was swiftly put down by British leaders in the late 50s and early 60s, where Canada repeatedly tried to make the Commonwealth a real thing, and Britain repeatedly tried to not make the Commonwealth a real thing. And so you end up with that set of elites outcompeted by this long string of industrialists that form the Laurentian Elite. And the Laurentian Elite have this unique opportunity in the late 50s and early 60s where they make the strategic decision to move Canada from the British sphere of influence to the US sphere of influence. And in doing so, they reinvent the country. The country gets a new flag, the country gets a new national anthem, and the country gets a new story to tell about what it is. So if you spoke to the average Canadian resident in 1880, they would have said that they were British subjects and that they weren't part of a separate country. But the Laurentian Elite decide that the real birthday of Canada is in 1867 when the colonial government was reorganized. And so every school child in Canada from that point forward is taught that 1867 is when the country was born. And actually in 1967, it turns 100. And they do all kinds of things. They host an Olympic Games and build all these parks to celebrate this country that they just finished inventing. Quite the flex of power and absolutely brilliant propaganda. So that's the Laurentian Elite. That's where they came from and how they developed. But through the late 60s and early 70s, there were two really quite ugly elite fractures that occurred in the country. The first is probably the most famous, and it is highlighted by the October crisis in Quebec, where FLQ terrorists kidnapped two federal government officials. One of them was killed in the cause of Quebec independence. Trudeau Sr. Invokes the War Measures Act, declares martial law, and takes the approach of putting soldiers on every street corner throughout Quebec and throughout certain other key areas of the country. And in doing so, he galvanizes Quebecois leaders to a kind of self-conscious leadership class. That's the story that most people kind of know. The elite fracture actually goes back further to the conscription crisis during the First World War. During the First World War, Canada had conscription and participated on behalf of Britain very aggressively. This was very unpopular in Quebec. There was classic populist discontent to the point where soldiers opened fire into crowds in Quebec City in 1917 to try to quell conscription riots. And from that time forward, all through the 30s, there's kind of left-wing Quebec nationalism that is not in power. As a result of the October crisis and the sentiment around it, you go from a position where there's left-wing Quebec nationalism that's out of power to a position where left-wing Quebecois nationalism controls the Quebec government and is the sort of governing ethos of that territory and that ethnic group from that point forward. And so that's the first of the two elite fractures that occurs to form the modern politics of Canada. The other elite fracture also occurs under the leadership of Trudeau the Elder, who, in his infinite wisdom, decided that he wanted to make Canada a kind of Venezuelan style economically nationalist country. And he developed a plan called the National Energy Policy, which was intended to produce national a state capital venture to control the oil and gas extraction going on in Western Canada. There's a bunch of really complicated political maneuvering that goes on in this period. Trudeau fails to execute this plan, but only fails after sort of partially executing it. And so you get this really intense political backlash from a series of very wealthy people in the oil industry who felt that their interests were threatened. Popular political slogan in Alberta at the time was "Let the Eastern bastards freeze in the dark." And that fracture was never forgotten. From that point forward, the Western Canadian oil elite put distance from them between themselves and the rest of the Laurentian elite. And over time, they develop increasingly separate interests, increasingly separate institutions, and eventually in the mid 90s go through a process and capture a political party to represent their interests, to try to get a say in Ottawa. The peak of their power to this point has been the Harper era, sort of 2005 to 2015, where their political representative party held power in Ottawa in a minority position for most of that period of time.
There's lots I want to ask you, and that's just an incredible overview to do extemporaneously. There's lots I want to ask you about the Laurentian elite, their mechanisms of power, how they've held onto it, and what their priorities are. But maybe to add character to that discussion before it happens, could you give a little social texture to them? So these are WASPs, these are small L liberal WASPs descended from, I suppose, ultimately Crown loyalists, although at some point in the World Wars that's changed. Where are they educated? Where do they congregate? Is it a church-driven movement, or is it social clubs?
Yeah, so these people are descended from WASPs, but the grouping is larger than that at this point. They become, like a lot of the British elite in the early 20th century, they have religious institutions that are sort of social, but they're fundamentally irreligious from that point forward. They're defined by their social institutions in the 20th century: golf clubs, private dining, private schooling, and exclusive universities and exclusive university programs. A lot of these institutions post the 1980s start to break down, and increasingly the things that the Laurentian elite have that keep them together are the prohibitively expensive private schools that they send in their children to. And they have particular neighborhoods in which they live that are sort of have invisible gates via real estate prices. They have private schools that are gated off by the high tuition rates. And they have particular university programs that they tend to congregate in, because those university programs are only useful if you also have the right set of connections to move from a university program in international relations to like an ambassador job or some patronage appointment by the federal government. As they've developed, particularly over the last 30 or 40 years, control of the federal government has become instrumental to maintaining their social cohesion.
It's very interesting. So there are deep parallels to my own country, England. There's continuously hand-wringing in the British media about how radically overrepresented old Etonians are. So people went to the public, meaning private school, Eton. And then specifically, there is a program at Oxford University, which is called PPE, colloquially Politics, Philosophy, and Economics, which is, I'm sure, an exceptionally interesting course. I know many people that graduated from it, but its primary function is a statement that I'm a person with the intention of joining the British establishment. Associated with that, you have, for example, the Bullingdon Club, which is a dining club now notorious, which featured Boris Johnson, David Cameron in various vintages, and there's photos of them standing around Oxford wearing dinner jackets and looking extremely excited about their future.
Yeah, it's almost an exact parallel. The thing that's fascinating about it is, even to the extent that these institutions get infiltrated by the outsiders, any one of these things on their own is not particularly useful. So if you get into this program at Oxford, right, and that's your only credential, and you don't have the rest of the social graph, that degree is actually pretty useless, right? It's not a very good qualification to go out and make your fortune with, but it's a very excellent qualification if it's paired with the 6 other qualifications and a social network to get you placed into some part of the British state.
Exactly. So, I mean, in the case of David Cameron, for example, another of those matrices would be he was the representative of Chipping Norton, which is a place in the British countryside that's extremely well represented amongst elites more generally. Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, one of the things I was doing in preparation for this call was I was just looking at, I thought like it'd be interesting to see where Justin Trudeau went to school, for example. Yeah. And I'm sure you know this, but for the benefit of the audience, Justin Trudeau went to a Jesuit school in Montreal called Collège Jean de Brébeuf. And then I looked up notable alumni out of interest, and you have Pierre Trudeau, his father, went to the same school, Robert Bourassa, the former premier of Quebec, and I could list them off, but it's a long list. And it's sort of like it's clearly a feeder school to the Canadian elite. And importantly, I suspect, and you can clarify this for me, it seems to be bilingual. So you learn the sort of French that's necessary for the governance of the eastern part of the country.
Well, one of the ways the Laurentian elite went to exclude the sort of lower class Anglos was by requiring bilingualism for a large number of positions in the federal bureaucracy. So one of the things that marks them as separate from the rest of the business elite in the country is that they are at least on paper bilingual in virtually all cases.
It's a sort of soft caste demarcator.
Yeah, exactly.
I was skimming a book you might be familiar with, Robert Ibbetson's The Big Shift, trying to make sure that I had some point of orientation in preparation for this discussion. And he talks both about the Laurentian elite, but also about the importance of what he calls the Laurentian consensus. And what he seems to mean by this is that there is a sort of front-facing political infrastructure, but behind that, before the question of politics is ever reached, the Laurentian elite has all these convening mechanisms and mechanisms for dialogue within the caste, which is necessary to achieve consensus on an issue, which they can sort of present to the public as a fait accompli.
Both the Laurentian elite and the Western elite, and to a lesser extent the Quebec elite, all have politics that's not party politics. So they all have engines for generating a consensus, and then that consensus is represented in government by their political vehicle. Whatever the Laurentian elite position is, that will be represented by the Liberal Party in Canada. Whatever the Western Canadian elite consensus is, will be represented by the Conservative Party of Canada. And there's no real politics within those parties. There's no discussion. There's basically absolute party discipline on all votes. You will almost never see dissent within the party on ideological grounds. You will see them represent a particular viewpoint from a particular class of people. All of the actual dialectic work to form that policy occurs outside of the formal government. The Laurentian elite have a class of what I would call the sense-making institutions, which are connected to the network of Canadian universities, but not necessarily actual parts of the Canadian universities. A good example people might be familiar with, because Jordan Peterson got famous, is the Munk debates. The Munk debates occur on the University of Toronto campus, but they're not actually an academic part of the university. They use the facility, they've got an endowment, but they're part of this sense-making apparatus that the Laurentian elite use before politics, before formal politics occurs. In the same way, the Western elite have a series of NGO think tanks through which their positions are arrived at. And then those positions are instantiated into politics through the parties they control.
One thing that springs to mind, in the UK, we have a real problem, and this is true in the US and elsewhere, where there is basically no incentive for any political party to solve the demographic problem, meaning the birth rate problem. And the reason for this is that, as you mentioned, politics is this open and fluid space with two parties sort of competing for the center of the same population, and things move around, obviously. In a land with clearer divisions between East and West, between the two parties and loyalties and so forth, I'm surprised that there isn't more of a sheer numbers competition to try and raise the sort of domestic birth rate in order for example, the West to expand its demographic power over the next 20 years?
Instead of attempting to do this by correcting the birth rate issue, this was attempted by the points-based immigration system, beginning in the late 20th century and passing through to the Trudeau period. During the time of Trudeau Sr., when he broke off the French-Canadian element of the elite class, not coincidentally and almost immediately afterwards, Trudeau came forward with a Canadian cultural policy that described Canada as a cultural mosaic rather than as a bicultural nation, and then proceeded to attempt to import enough people to make that true. So he created the points-based immigration system and started to try to flood the country with other minorities so as to dilute the narrative of French Canada as a kind of an aggrieved minority. So there's been some of this. The latest version of it is the Century Initiative, which was an effort by the Laurentian elite to try to grow the country's economy such that they could get out of this subordinate position they have with respect to the United States, and also to kind of lock the Western Canadian elite out of power. So you have some of this, but it's typically done with immigration. It's not done with birth rates. The group that attempted to do this with birth rates was the French Canadians, who from sort of 1850 to 1950 used to have this phrase, which translates more or less to revenge of the cradle, where the clerical elite that preceded the modern French Canadian elite very, very aggressively encouraged high fecundity among the French Catholic population. They did so very consciously as part of an effort to preserve the French Canadian nation. And in point of fact, from the period of the conquest through to 1960, French Canada is one of the most reproductively successful societies that has ever existed in that period. I think its TFR over the period is something like 8.5. It's wild, though it's a bit difficult to track in the colonial period.
That's fascinating. It's something I'm going to have to look into further.
There's a piece on my Substack, part 1 of French Canadian Ethnostate, that goes into this a little bit. It's not a strategy, because the reinvention of Canada Americanized Canada. Part of that Americanization was taking a very different, let's call it, religious and social policy. Inside the envelope of the religious and social policy, which is acceptable under the auspices of the American Empire, there aren't really strategies for addressing the birth rate gap.
Where does and you can take this either way around as you think makes sense, where does the Laurentian elite's financial wealth come from?
Yeah.
Or is that a result of its political power? And if so, if the political power came first, how does it convert that into wealth?
Yeah, so the wealth came first and is generational at this point. And interestingly, the engine that used to produce the wealth, which is behind the Laurentian elite, has almost completely disappeared in the intervening period. In the period between 1850 and 1945, the Laurentian elite were the class of people who owned all the industrial interests inside Canada. And they had high tariff walls against the United States to keep U.S. industrialists out, and they had some tariff walls against Great Britain to keep British industrialists out. In this environment, they had a whole collection of very high margin industrial businesses doing things like building farm equipment and just the kind of basic industrial productivity that built the country. In the period after the war, the military industrial part of the Laurentian of that apparatus starts to break down. You keep the consumer industrial part of it up until about 1980. And in 1980, a decision is taken among the Laurentian elite to liberalize Canada's trade relationship with the United States, which has a number of consequences. First, it creates the environment which enriches the Western elite. So it creates the opportunity for those who exploit the country's natural resources to become enormously wealthy, because they can now access the international markets without impediment, or at least with a lot less impediment than prior to 1980. And second, it eliminates this huge comparative advantage that the Laurentian elite owned businesses used to possess. So many of these businesses fail in this time, but those that endure, businesses like Bombardier and a few of the other major industrial concerns in Canada go on not because of their excellence in industrial process, but rather because they're the kind of businesses that are patronized by the government that the Laurentian elite control. So there's this kind of inside-outside game that goes on where it's very easy as a government to say that we've got a Canadian source. And so Canadian sourcing means buying goods from industrial concerns that are owned by Friends of the Liberal Party of Canada. And so you have this situation where companies like Bombardier are regularly the recipients of not especially competitive contracts for things like public transit infrastructure and things where the ultimate buyer is some level of government.
Do they, in exerting this kind of political leadership over this period, one of the factors that historically has justified the continuing power of elite is some kind of artistic or high cultural leadership? And obviously the 20th century more broadly is kind of barren in this regard. Do you think, I mean, in your mind, is there any cultural greatness of Canada that it is legitimate to ascribe to this body of people?
There was a kind of high culture in Canada that they promoted through the institutions that they controlled, which was like a continuation and reflection of the high culture of the British Empire. This was disassembled as part of the Cultural Revolution So, for example, when my father was a young boy, he played the violin and he was transported across Canada to play in hotels across the country for high tea, along with the orchestra that he was a part of in the 60s. And so you saw this kind of sponsorship of the arts by the Laurentian elite of the period, and the arts in this case being the excellent performance of traditional European classical art, ranging from music to fine art to opera to whatever else, right? We used to have Shakespeare in the Park all over the place. We have in Ontario, there is a town which is called Stratford, which has a reproduction of Stratford in the UK, which performs Shakespearean plays all summer in an annual Shakespeare festival. This is the kind of culture that this elite class once produced. The Laurentian elite, from a cultural point of view, have been in decline, quite severe decline, in the late 20th and early 21st century. And their sponsorship of the arts has been in decline at the same time.
Do you think that's, some believe that the pervasive ideology of society is shaped by elites in order to serve their own interests? But it does seem that, to an extent, the Laurentian elite might have got a bit high off their own supply here, and that it has destroyed family formation amongst the class that is supposed to be leading the country.
The Laurentian elite can't survive without these. So the arrangement that the Laurentian elite have is that their political position is partly justified by Blue America. And there's all kinds of critical moments in the history of Canada where this becomes explicit rather than implicit. For example, during the truck protests, when the War Measures Act was invoked in order to arrest the protesters in Canada who were resisting COVID mandates, one of the problems that the governing powers had in Canada was that they couldn't get any tow truck companies to come and tow the trucks away. They refused to participate. So the Laurentian elite went across the border and got tow trucks from Michigan to come and clear the truck blockades. By the same token, when it was time to physically clear out the protesters in Ottawa, they went and got support from their American friends in order to have enough officers to put on the street to physically disperse the crowd. This is not a unique moment in Canadian history. The Laurentian elite owe their position in power to their relationship with Blue America, both from the point of view of propaganda control and from the point of view of support at critical junctures. As a result, they can't be too far out of step with Blue America from a cultural point of view. Otherwise, it damages their position from a propaganda point of view. So they have to participate in the cultural decline of Blue America, at least in their public-facing activity. This fact has generationally contributed to their decline as a subculture within Canada. Their intellectual decline, as well as their decline from a family their decline in from a dynastic point of view.
One thing that I really was fascinated by when you brought it up, because I never thought of it before, but it made complete sense once you said it, was that the adoption of DEI actually caused a big problem, and it threw a wrench into the system that you were describing as basically functional for a long time, in that these elites could skim off the best talent from around the country, from other worse parts of the country, and absorb them into the central Laurentian consensus making machine. DEI interrupted that. Perhaps you could explain how that mechanism actually is returning power to the fringes of society.
Yeah, I mean, it's very straightforward. For most of the last 150 years, if you were an exceptionally talented young man born somewhere in Canada, you would have had a straight path through a variety of selective mechanisms to join the Laurentian elite and be placed in a position where your economic and social position becomes dependent upon your participation in that elite class. You would have been picked up by some, given a scholarship to a Canadian university, given a management track position in one of these industrial concerns that they controlled for a long time. And you would have had an opportunity there to distinguish yourself and join the elite class of the country, either in government or in business or in culture. That mechanism stood for a very long time, but there have been two things that have really interrupted it. First, the Canadian university system, which was an integral filtering mechanism, became financially dependent on foreign students because foreign students had unregulated tuition fees. So they were only allowed to charge a certain amount of money to a domestic student, but they could charge whatever they wanted to a foreign student. So they sold their prestige internationally, particularly in China, to get enough cash to prop up the development of that system. The backhanded consequence of that is that first, because of the relationship with foreign students, and later because of DEI, that system has become less and less functional as a selective filter to bring out the most talented young men from around Canada and place them into starting positions in the Laurentian elite, either in government or in business. Then within business, the legal requirements for DEI in large organizations, which go back quite a ways, have interfered with the ability of talented young men to move from those kind of junior positions into positions where they have an opportunity to distinguish themselves and join the Laurentian elite in reality, rather than kind of being these kind of aspiring young people. The only ways in have been the arts tracks and the kind of generational legacy tracks, and the odd member of that class has been able to join as a consequence of exceptional entrepreneurial success. But those are all going to be rare tracks. The mainstream method for the harvesting of talented people from the country, from outside of the existing Laurentian elite class, has broken down. Instead, those talented people have had to make their own way. For a significant part of this period, that meant going to the United States and making their way in the US business world. But the exclusionary forces that were operating in Canada beginning in the 90s also kicked up in the US and also blocked the paths to financial success there progressively. And so more and more, the best and brightest of Canada that are not already members of the Laurentian elite find themselves with no path for advancement except to build their own. When you build your own, you don't owe a loyalty politically to the sponsors and mentors, and therefore you don't inherently join their class. Instead, you tend to represent the people who helped you get where you want to be, often your own community, often with a certain degree of resentment towards the center for excluding you for less talented people.
What are the threats you see for the Laurentian elite on the horizon? Perhaps you could say something about the rising Western powers, to the extent you see them as rising. Yeah. Perhaps you could say something about the potential for greater autonomy in independent communities like Christians like you and I might want to pursue. And any reflections you have on the sort of increasing menace of the US in exerting stronger power over Canada, I think would be fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, The Laurentian elite are in a very delicate position at the moment. They have a situation where their position with respect to the Quebecois elite depends on them being able to harvest wealth from the west of the country and deliver it to Quebec as a bribe to stay in Confederation. You have a situation where an increasingly self-conscious Western elite is taking every step available to try to break down that mechanism to harvest their wealth and redistribute it eastward. You have a situation where their traditional strongholds in Canadian business are a very low ebb historically because of the decision that was taken in the 80s to open up and liberalize Canadian trade. Their only real remaining tether that keeps them in a position of power is their control of the formal and informal government in Canada. So they're in a position where they really can't afford to lose elections, to risk their patronage networks in academia being attacked. So they've gotten, as a result of this, they've had to become much more totalitarian in the way that they control narratives. So, for example, we went from a position where we had state media and non-state media in Canada. We had the CBC, but we also had lots of non-state media of various description, some of which was opposed to the Laurentian elite. For example, the National Post was a noted outlet of the Western elite for a time. And there are definitely Quebec nationalist publications that exist, to a position now where 30 to 40% of the salary of every journalist in the country working for an accredited institution is paid by the federal government. And so there's a much tighter envelope on messaging. By the same token, we have more censorship laws than ever. We have more hate speech laws than ever. We have a lot less academic freedom in the institutions to seriously discuss questions that you would need to discuss in order to form a new Laurentian consensus. Their hold on power has become a lot more brittle. And as a result, it's like a tightly clenched apparatus. It's holding on very tight, but you could very easily see it slip and break. So that's the situation with the Laurentian elite right at the moment. It has been improved somewhat by the behavior of the United States, which have really damaged the Western elite quite a bit by the way that they've acted with regard to trade and with these kinds of threats of annexation. A big part of the Western elite's wealth is built on exports to the United States, and their narrative has been that the United States is fundamentally not a threat, and therefore we can afford to have an economy which is deeply integrated with theirs. That narrative has taken a big hit as a result of the events of the second Trump presidency, the threats to annexation, all this kind of stuff. So that has helped the Laurentian elite a lot to maintain control over the country. But they still have these very difficult dynamics that they don't really have great answers to. At the same time, the country is getting poorer by the day, and their mechanisms for elite recruitment remain very weak. All this is to say that the prospects for their de facto removal from power have never been better, but at the same time, the prospects that they will punish you for attempting to challenge their power de facto have also never been stronger. So you're in a position now where you're much more likely to be successful in the long term in building an alternative to their institutions, but you're also in a position where it's much, much closer to formally illegal to do so. So it's a kind of delicate situation. If you're one of the established elite groups, then they have all sorts of mechanisms at their disposal to protect themselves and to try to wage that war. If you're attempting to challenge that power not from an established elite class, for example, like the Christian minority that I belong to, it's a better and worse situation. On the one hand, you don't have to worry about your talented young people defecting from your community and joining the Laurentian elite, because it's just not possible in many cases. On the other hand, if you're Trinity Western University and you're trying to develop a law school, it's much more likely that the Law Society of Ontario will lock you up in court for years and try to compel you to change your code of conduct and try to compel you to give up your identity as an authentic member of that community in order to in order to undermine your position. So it's a delicate and difficult moment, and it's hard to say exactly how it will break. I think it's very much tied up in the larger future of Canada as a kind of vassal to the Blue American Empire, an empire which is looking somewhat precarious right at the moment.
Well, let's conclude by saying, Laurentian Elite, do not attack us. This is a pro Laurentian Elite podcast. We're pro Justin Trudeau or against Justin Trudeau, whatever you prefer. You know, we're pro mass immigration or against mass immigration. You know, whatever you prefer, we're down, ride or die.
Yeah, there you go.
Please, free speech. Yeah, Black Horse, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. Please shout out again where people can find your fantastic work.
Yeah, you can find it. The Substack is the Red Ensign. There's a YouTube channel, the Red Ensign. Find me on Twitter at the Black Horse 65. Talking about the Red Ensign is a publication that's a little bit broader than just myself. I'm trying to get a number of other prominent Canadian dissidents to write there, to podcast there, to try to build a sense-making apparatus outside of Canada's existing elite classes, and try to build something to build some real intelligent critique of the Canadian political situation. So hopefully some of your listeners will enjoy that.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. See you next time. If you enjoyed this discussion, please go to becomingnoble.substack.com or click the link in the description, where you can find my best work, including over 100 essays, interviews with popular guests, and our chat, where you can talk with other excellent and like-minded people. That's becomingnoble.substack.com.